Good morning, everybody. Hope you had a really great week this last week, and I know I did. It's been really a fun week, and I've had a lot of things accomplished and been blessed. Well, we're right in the middle of starting actually Advent, and I thought what I would like to do is that I would like to do a lesson on Advent for the next three sessions and three Sundays. It's an exciting time, getting ready for Christmas, but that time of Advent is so special. And as I was thinking about it, reflecting on it, I was remembering that a couple of years ago, Karen and I were driving down the road after attending worship there at Brentwood United Methodist, and it was a cold winter day. As we were driving along, we were kind of both kind of quiet, and she looked over and she noticed the trees going by, and we were commenting and talking about how big trees were around there. They were so beautiful. And then it started dawning on us as we discussed it, and she's the one that brought it up, that there are some trees have leaves and some don't. And the ones that had leaves did not have leaves as we were going by were just so big and majestic because we could see everything about them. And we could see also some trees that had leaves that clung to the branches, even though other trees have lost all their leaves. And we were kind of talking and wondering why uh, what we should do because our house was full of trees and we knew we had to rake a lot of leaves coming up. And so it was about that time. And so we were discussing all the yard work we had to do. So I want to take that theme and I want to talk about during Advent the next three sessions called the Trees of Winter. And that'll be our theme. And but let's look first of all, I want to talk about trees as part of God's creation and what the Bible says how we must interact with trees and how they're symbolic about Him's relationship to us in the Bible. I mean, I love trees. I really do. I see a majestic big tree, and I always have loved seeing them. Even the little boy, uh, the creative endeavors of God, has such profound insight of wonder in the amount of trees and how God made them and what they symbolize in the world and the beauty of them. And so there is much to gain by interacting with reading and studying God's art. And even the book of nature, which is the second holy book, if you think about it, how God's displayed his wonder and his beauty through all around us, wherever we go. And trees are a symbolic and a very prominent place within the creation story. I think God must like trees as well because these are like signposts that are scattered all around us. The Bible is full of references comparing our spiritual journey to trees in some form. It goes in Genesis and you go in Numbers and Deuteronomy, Psalms, Proverbs, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Daniel, Ezekiel, Hosea, and Micah. And even Jesus talked about cutting off branches, and Paul wrote about grafting branches. And then that haunting story from Nathan of being seen and known while sitting under a fig tree. Are you getting the idea now? Trees are just everywhere in the Bible. It's a symbolism and it's a symbol of God's spirit and God's example of working in our lives as well as the beauty of God's creation. And trees make life possible. It really does. They provide shade, they provide beauty, and other kind of gifts from the tires on our cars to the aspirin in our medicine cabinets. Trees are part of that. They give great pleasure to kids who love to climb trees. And I'm one of those. I just loved climbing trees as I was growing up. And I've got some broken bones to prove that I did that. And I just love to go up and climb to the very lofty top. And in fact, that's how a lot of kids earn their spur of courage is see how high they can climb into the branches of a tree. And even today, when I see a beautiful, majestic tree with big branches coming out, my first thought is that tree is climbable. And I recall the last time I tried to climb a tree, and it was not pretty. So I refrained from trying to do that in my life as well. But when I see a majestic tree, I think about the beauty of it, and just it just awes me what I see. But beyond the physical needs, trees can also teach us some spiritual lessons. Other than people, trees are mentioned more than any other creation in the Bible. Did you know that? There's a tree on the first page of Genesis, and there is a tree on the last page of Revelations. The first psalm exhorts believers to be like a tree. And every major character, every major theological event has a tree marking the spot. Something. Elijah was under a tree. I mean, the list just goes on and on. Indeed, Adam's first instructions were to dress and keep the trees in Eden, it says in the second chapter of Genesis. So I want to go over six spiritual lessons that we can learn from the trees that God has planted in the scripture and what he's trying to show us possibly. And I think it's fascinating. Well, the first lesson that I have come across is that trees turn toward the light. You know, one of the first memories I have was in kindergarten. It is planting seeds in two pots, and one was placed in the windowsill, and the other was placed in a closet, in a dark closet. And every day we examined both of the pots. And for several weeks, nothing happened. And then the seeds sprouted. At first, both plants looked the same. They began to diverge. The plant in the windowsill began turning its leaves toward the sun, but the one in the closet became pale and thin and withdrawn, and in a confused manner, didn't know what to do. So trees grow toward light. They turn toward it because of a process that is called photoplasm, which is from the Greek meaning light and also turning. I probably messed that up. Phototropism, excuse me, I mispronounced that. Um, but it's a fascinating thing how the leaves, or even flowers do that for that matter, but trees do the same thing. If you plant a tree up against the house, for example, on one side of the tree, the branches grow out toward the light. Even a tree bends that way if it can, if it's small enough. So you have to kind of keep it going straight. While the backside of the tree has less leaves because they can't get to the light. So it really has a lesson there for all of us there. And Jesus said, I am the light of the world, it says in John. A tree naturally seeks light. And we as Christians naturally seek where life is given. And that is going toward Christ, who is our light of the world. And so we turn toward him. What a great lesson that is. Now, second lesson that I came across is that trees bring forth fruit. Many of them do. I mean, what good would the apple tree be if it would ever produce no apples? Likewise, if our lives should produce meaningful fruit, and it's easy to look like a fruit tree, but Jesus said that we must be known by the fruit we produce. So just outside where I have my office is a very large apple tree. And this fall I had picked several bushels full of sweet apples to create all kind of goodies like cookies, and I made cobblers, and I made apple pies. But the tree had given to me its fruit. We should not only produce outward fruit, but inward as well. So what is inner fruit? What is the fruit of the Holy Spirit that works within our mind and our soul to make us the image of Christ? It is the fruit of our closeness to God. As we get closer to him, the Christ image is embedded in our lives and radiates from us. So the fruit is not only outward, but it's also inward in how we act and how we treat other people. We should always have in mind that we are described as a tree of life in our own faith. And in that tree of life gives life to those around us, gives shade to them, but gives that fruit, that nourishment, because it gives our testimony to those people as well. St. Paul, the apostle, described the fruit of the Spirit in his letter to the Galatians. It says, but the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness, and temperance. There's your fruit right there that we're supposed to be having coming out of our lives. In fact, Jesus chose you for the very purpose of bearing fruit, it says in John 15. So the very reason why we exist is to give fruit from the very life that Christ has in us. You did not choose me, but I chose you, he says, and appointed you that you should go and bear fruit, and that your fruit should remain, that the Father may give you whatever you ask in his name. Fruit, the giving of goodness from our life, of what God has given us. As we grow in him, we bear that fruit to the world. Now let's think about another spiritual insight. Let's talk about the tree rings. For the tree, winter marks a very passing year, and expanding its girth with a ring around its base is how a tree shows how it has endured that season. Not only do rings provide strength to support the tree as it grows and the new growth of branches and foliage, but the story is locked into this very fiber of that tree. The ring holds its history, the climate it endured, the seasons of scarcity, the abundance of water and nutrients, of sunlight, of all this marks a tree. Now, I love to cut firewood. It's one of my passions. It's just kind of enjoyment for me. It's something I can produce, if you will. And also, it's a great thing for the wintertime. And I did a lot of wood cutting this last summer. But whenever I cut down a tree that's dead and I wanted to make it into firewood, I always stop and after I cut the tree down and look at the rings of it. And as the rings tell a history of that tree. And so it is for us. If we take time to remember where we have been in our life and where we are going to go, those are our rings. And like Joshua arranging the stones from Jordan to mark the movement of God in the life of the people, we remember. We learn and we share with others. Tattooed in our hearts are the stories of God's work in our life. So that is where we have been changed, where God has strengthened us. And the history is right there in regard to our history of how we have walked the journey of faith. You know, high up in the Colorado mountains here where I live, the air kind of gets thin. In fact, those who come to visit here, it takes about a couple of weeks for people to get used to the higher altitude. And the snows are heavy sometimes in the lives of these singing trees. Now, the trees I'm talking about that are singing are called the aspen trees. In fact, there's some right outside our kitchen that are growing right there, and the leaves have now fallen off. But during the springtime and all throughout the summer and in the early fall, the winds blow through them, and you could just hear them clattering and singing, as you could probably call it that. But these white-barked mountain choir depends on each other for more than just music. Aspen groves share a singular root system. The life and the health of one of the aspen affects the other. But what you can't see is that the roots are under the ground. It is woven together as a community of trees. And so it's so much like our ways. Within our community, right there at the RIM class or whatever class where you attend, or even a church service itself, or where you live, there's a community. There are people around you who are connected to you by this root system that goes under the ground that when you hurt, they hurt. When you are joyful, they are joyful. When you have a frustration, or they can pick up that. And what happens is because we are mutually supportive. When one has a problem, then there's a migration of the community around you to uplift you and support you because it's affecting them as one community. And contrary to popular belief, we are nothing like an island that lives all by ourselves. We are connected. And we see our interconnectedness as humans in a global and environmental affairs, but also in God's church. Our connectedness is paramount. It is no coincidence that Paul referenced us as a body, interconnected, interdependent. And this is God's design for his children. The spiritual life is highly personal. It's not private. It is connected to other people. And community is, by its very nature, takes time, lots of time. It's only through seasons after seasons of living together, of struggling and suffering, rejoicing and addressing conflict, that a deep Christian community is birthed. It's when we know each other, the good, the bad. It's when it's no longer fun, exciting, and safe, yet we choose to continue to do life together and remain committed to each other in a shared vision. Much like that grove of aspen, its years in the making of the real fruit of life together cannot be fully matured into just a few short years. It has to grow over time, become a solid, interconnected grove. So you go pour into some people for the next 20 years, and we just may find our lives together with a great beauty. Of course, our ever increasing mobile society that we see around us all the time, and some in our family, our younger people like that, creates a lot of challenges. We'll have to work with what we have, but we got to show them how community, how family, and the Christ like family is so important. And that's another lesson from our trees. You know, growth is ever happening in the life of a tree. There's nothing stagnant about it. It is either gradually dying or slowly being renewed. And that's our next lesson. We come down to springtime. I do love the gentle shift of spring, don't you? I mean, after a winter time when all of a sudden things are been quiet and there's been storms or was just bleakness a little bit, where it may be, the air and the ground goes into rest a little bit. Then all of a sudden those first tulips come out of the ground and the grass starts to come up and the trees start budding out. That newness, that beauty around us and the smell is so wonderful. Like most growth for us, it's ever so gradual. We never really know it's taking place in our lives until something happens that brings it out, that we are aware of it. I look at the trees at the end of winter time, and I examine those brittle and flimsy branches for that soft bulge of new buds coming out of the tree. The tree anticipates God's inevitable calling forth of a brand new season. Expect it with regeneration. They'll soon no longer be able to contain its enthusiasm. It'll just all of a sudden one day we're there and all of a sudden the buds are coming out and before you know it we glance up again and the leaves are there or the flowers are there. It seems like overnight. Out of the hiding it shines with radiance and glory, full obeying the will of the Father. And so we're like that tree. Our winter labors and time reach fruition. Our growth is a slow and natural process, a work and a movement of the Spirit in our life. And we can't force it or will fruit into being because we want it to be there. It takes time to grow the fruit. It takes time to bud. It takes time to connect. Yet by submitting and laying our everyday ordinary life before God and offering our time, our energies, and our lives into the care of God, in due time, our fruit matures after a season. Spiritual formation is not about us finding the secret mechanism to make God work as if He could pull a holy lever and all of a sudden blessedness comes out. No, relationships don't work like that. The tree doesn't will its fruit into being, nor can we. It's a natural outgrowth of life with God. It's just like the natural processes of the sun, water, and nutrients, and the grace of God working in the wonder of life. The tree obeys and receives all that God gives. We want so badly to be good people, empowered to love God and others well. Yet, our resurrection into Christ's likeness is a work of God. It's about grace, life from death, no system. Our fruit is a gift from God. I was last uh, spring walking through the woods, and I encountered the most beautiful smell. And it was just all the trees around me were kind of, just starting up, and they were okay, but the smell was overpowering. It was just luring, and I kept walking upon the smell, trying to follow it. And I came around the edge into a valley or a little meadow area, and there was a whole stand of ponderosa pines. The smell of that pine was breathtaking. It was beautiful. It smelled so fresh. And I just stood there and soaked it in, the beauty and the majesticness of the trees themselves. They were just swaying with the breeze above me. It filled me with wonder and awe. Much like the pine tree, our deep life with God cannot be contained, and the fragrance of God's grace fills the spaces that we find ourselves in. Lastly, the sixth spiritual lesson for us to think about trees of the winter. Human life is so short, but not for trees. There are trees alive today that were alive in the time of Moses. God put the notion of living on a vast time scale in our hearts, it says in Ecclesiastes chapter 3. It says, He has made everything beautiful in its appropriate time. He also put obscurity in their hearts so that no one comes to know the work that God has done from the beginning to the end. No one knows it. He has done that in such a beautiful, awesome way. I mean, how many times do we make decisions based on short term gain? What would the world look like if the first thing we think about, is what we do? As stewards of God's love, we are responsible for the generations of children that grow up behind us and look at us as symbols. According to the book of Revelation, trees have a place in heaven as well. Revelation described the tree of life that says, the leaves of the tree are like the healing of the nations. So trees remind us that life is much bigger than our present moment. Their deep roots and sprawling branches cause us to look at heaven and eternity beyond. So our world is completely surrounded by God's little creative projects, the trees, flowers, birds, rocks, in their own way proclaiming God's wisdom, goodness, and glory. There's so much for us to learn. The next week, we're going to discuss the three types of trees of winter. And the third will be the last Sunday before Christmas. It'll be a special one about a tree, about the coming of the Christ child. So today, as you walk outside or you look out through your windows, just take a moment and gaze at the trees of God's reminder of who you are and whose you are. God has placed them there to bless you and bless me. The trees of winter. More to follow next Sunday. Well, God bless you. Have a wonderful week. I pray for you. You pray for me. Bye-bye.